Hi everyone, welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan, and welcome to Season 3, Paul,
Yes,
of Wandering DMs. First episode of January in 2021. Looking forward to all kinds of stuff that we have available this third season here. Starting with, today, we're going to be talking about Barbarians in D&D and maybe other role-playing games. Your extra powerful fighter from the wildlands, and how he or she has, or they have appeared in various editions of D&D over the years. How many barbarians do you see in your games these days, Paul?
Actually, my current 5th edition D&D game has a regular player playing a barbarian, so we see that.
Okay.
Also the barbarian character was a fairly popular, reasonably popular choice in the Big Bad, so we saw him, Khaim the Vanquisher, several times there. I'd say, honestly, as I look back on sort of older editions that I've played across the years, I think, if anything, it's gained popularity.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. We had, so in Season 2 last year, we had a series of episodes on what I would refer to as the 4 main classes in D&D: Fighter, Wizard, Cleric, Thieves. And so now maybe in Season 3, we're going to be digging into classes that came historically later, or what you call subclasses or something like that. And I feel like, because when we were talking about fighters last season, we were saying they're kind of the mainstay for, you have a new player, fighters are usually the simplest thing to play. Mm-hmm. And maybe barbarians have kind of elbowed their way into that position of people, you're going to be hitting things with a fairly big weapon. You're not going to have an enormous arcane list of abilities, and I feel like maybe some people have come to see barbarians as filling that slot of the most basic thing you can pick up and play on the fly for the first time.
I guess I could see that. They're I think that your fightor with I see William in the chat has already either anticipated or agreed with me, depending on what temporal order that popped up in. Thank you, William. So it's already 2 votes to 1, and we can put this to rest. Good night, everybody. We'll see you next week. Done. So, just for those on the podcast, William writes, Barbarian seems to be a go-to character choice for a lot of my newish players. I could see it. I still think that the fighter with the champion background in 5th edition is a little simpler than the barbarian. Barbarian has some rules. I think we saw this in the Big Bad, where some players maybe stumbled a little bit on the rage mechanics and the sort of offset of, you have to, especially as it fits into the action economy. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Right. So it's sort of like it costs a bonus action to invoke the rage, and then possibly you can do extra stuff with your bonus action, but you have to be raging first. So there's a sort of a 2-round delay on that. I
gotta admit, even I to this day am just slightly hazy about whether the correct rule in 5th edition. Okay, so the increased version of rage is frenzy, right? Frenzied rage,
right,
in 5th edition, and I'm still a little hazy about whether that gets called at the moment you first go into the rage, or if you call that in a later round.
I'm fairly certain it has to be invoked as you are raging. So because you, as a barbarian in 5th edition, you'll have some number of rages per day, right? So you're resource limited a little bit there. And pretty sure the text of Frenzy says that as you invoke a rage, you may declare it to be a frenzy.
Gotcha.
So that's but even then, right, there's other problems, honestly, with we've jumped. This is unusual for us. I feel like we've jumped straight into the 5th edition stuff and haven't gone over the historical stuff yet. But it is more fresh in my brain again because I have a player using it.
Right.
The other stumbling block that I saw a lot when I first started playing with 5th edition Barbarians is whether or not they get any bonus to hit or attacks in any way. So there's some language in there about raging, about how it gives you advantage on strength-based skills and checks,
right?
Which some people originally, or some folks I've seen, think that would apply to attack rolls. Now, I've seen clarification since that it definitely does not.
Gotcha.
So that's a really interesting fact, I think, about the 5th edition Barbarian. If you look at it, the sort of standard Barbarian, ultimately, most of their abilities are not really
geared around dishing out damage. They're geared around taking damage, right? That's the major ability that a barbarian has, is when they're raging, they take half damage from pretty much everything. And so they can just get up there and just take the hits. And that's how I see them get played, right? They're kind of the tank, as MMO players call it, the tank character who can get in there and absorb the damage.
The Rage in 5th edition actually doesn't add anything to attacks.
That's correct.
I feel like I'm hallucinating.
No, that's
really?
correct. Yeah. Yeah. Huh. No, I mean, granted that the barbarian has pretty good bonuses to hit, and has you tends to use the biggest weapons, so already they're kind of dealing out pretty high damage, but no more than any fighter could.
Crazy. Somehow that's escaped me. I knew that it says they get the advantage on strength checks, and I knew that wasn't going to feed directly into combat, but I just assumed there was some other thing. That's crazy. So David's saying it adds to damage. Is that the thing?
Yeah, I'm sure he's right. I'm gonna look it up right now just to make 100% sure.
Yeah.
But I'm sure he's right. But I feel like that's not, like, again, I wouldn't call that like the major ability.
Okay.
Right? Like, I feel like the major thing that they get when raging is that ability to absorb damage.
Okay. Well, now I think we're all looking this up now.
You get a bonus to the damage roll that increases as you gain levels, as shown in the raid damage. Yeah, yes,
okay.
Correct. It is correct. You do gain extra damage. Gotcha. So yeah, you deal a little more damage.
So I see it as +2 for levels 1 through 8.
Yeah,
and then +3 up to level 15, and +4 up to level 20. So as long as you're playing in levels 1 through 8, that's just a fixed +2 damage.
Yeah, and again, most players I've seen of 5th edition barbarians are usually using great weapons, so they're already out there dealing a d12 of damage, right? And if you go back to the big bad, if you look at Deontay playing the barbarian in episode help me out, Dan, which one was Madbird? Was that 3? Great.
I think 3.
You can really see the tactics there, I think, really well, in that he's using the frenzy to get as many attacks as possible, and using the ability to make a reckless attack, which allows you to gain advantage on your attack rolls, and thus everyone gets advantage on hitting you, because he doesn't care, because he's going to take half damage. And the point is just to get as many dice onto the table to basically fish for crits. And that's what he's doing. He's just fishing for criticals.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So we all agree that in 5th edition, the basic barbarian rage isn't adding anything to hit, isn't adding anything to their attacks, and obviously, all of us agree that the primary feature that's interesting about a barbarian is their rage.
Yes, I agree with that. Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's fix our surprising leap over the history. And go back and see where barbarians came from initially before I forget to say. And this will also explain why I was a little bit hazy about 5th edition rules, because as usual, my intuition, my personal mind frame is thinking about the early stuff that I was investigating in the last week or two. So, Paul, if you bring up the first image there, I have some screenshots from the first paragraph. There is from before D&D was even a glimmer in anybody's mind. That first paragraph is from Chainmail, where they have a little bit of you have mass combat, and then you have a little bit of a historical optional rules, including for Viking Berserkers. And so this isn't called Barbarians. Nothing on this page is called a Barbarian. They're called Berserkers. You can see the only ability in that first paragraph that Berserkers get is a bonus to hit, a +2.
There you go.
So they go into a frenzy. They cannot run away once they do that, and they get +2 to hit. Now that's in a system where you're rolling 2d6. So in some sense, that's only about half the range of a d20, right?
Okay. But still, +2 on a d6 is pretty significant.
2d6, right?
2d6. Oh, okay, 2d6. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Agreed. Significant, right?
Still significant, yeah.
Technically, if you like, in my mind, if you were to convert that directly to a D20 system, that ought to be doubled up to about +4. I would think.
Sounds about right.
That and I see that William in the chat again is saying the modern class would be more accurately named Berserkers, and you can totally see that's the phrasing they used in early D&D here. The second paragraph on the screen is original D&D, 1974. This is in the monster section. You could not pick this. This was not held out as an option for player characters. So these are NPC humans that you're probably going to run into and fight in the wilderness. And again, their primary ability is they get +2 to hit. No advantage to damage, no extra damage taking ability, just +2 to hit. And then I also pulled out, this is one you could kind of miss, I also pulled out from the original D&D supplement that on deities and demigods. I pulled out the little blurb on Odin from the Norse mythos, and the very last thing, and I know people can't read all this, but the very last thing, bullet point number 4, is Odin's allies around him are inflicted with berserker rage, and basically they increase their fighter levels by 4.
Okay.
Is what it says there.
Okay.
The deity tier also does the same thing, basically, in those rules.
I think
you see the same thing in AD&D. You go forward to first edition, right? AD&D is just copy-paste this, basically. So you have NPC Berserkers in the monster manual. They get +2 to hit, and it's basically the exact same thing in the core rules of first edition.
Yeah. I mean, I'll point out, again, in 5th edition, very common sort of pattern that we see for all classes is that around, I think it's 3rd or 4th level, they gain some path or some choice, right? Like you're gonna, as a wizard, you're gonna pick your school. As a barbarian, you're gonna pick your path, and one of them is the path of the berserker. So certainly, berserking or berserker and barbarians are even to still in 5th edition kind of tied together thematically.
Correct. And I think that's grown over the years. They've actually kind of merged over the years, is what we'll see. As you had berserkers and barbarians as fundamentally separate things initially, and they kind of merged into one single thing. So in this era, like in the 70s, you have a couple Dragon magazine articles early on where people are trying to work out maybe we could make Berserker a character class. And interestingly, the very first version of that tied them very closely into lycanthropy, actually. Is, of course, Berserker, in the German, to my understanding, means bare shirt. Is supposedly, historically, the people that did this wore itchy, bare shirts and I guess no other armor, and were kind of considered fierce like that.
Interesting.
And so the very initial attempt to make Berserker a character class kind of digs into that, and at a higher level, you can literally turn into a bear. Right?
Makes sense.
Just like the character from Lord of the Rings kind of thing. Or if you pick another clan, you could turn into a wolf or a tiger or a rat or something like that, or any option out of the lycanthropy list. You generally don't see that today too much, but that was an early attempt, which was kind of interesting.
Fascinating. And that was a Dragon magazine article that gave that stuff?
Yeah, I think that was Dragon 18. I think that was, and it's funny because that article actually had a warning tag on it for some reason of like, be extra cautious about using this because it hasn't been play tested very much. It might be totally broken.
Yeah. Cool.
Which I'm like, you could just have on every single article all the time.
yeah, pretty much. Though I do feel like, this is, you see this very commonly as the pattern for how things get introduced into the game, right? As they show up in a magazine as a alternate rule, and there's usually like 6 or 7 different attempts at it. And then somehow eventually it gets formalized and somebody says, all right, we're going to either make an amalgam or pick the best one and integrate it into the official rules.
That's a great point, because that's actually totally how the current barbarian class came about. Was that Dragon number 3? Actually, the Berserker class that's tied to lycanthropy is actually in Dragon magazine number 3, as a matter of fact. So let's actually see where the barbarian. So again, we're talking Berserkers. We're not talking barbarians.
Yeah.
So if you flip to the next slide there, Paul, you're going to see an article by Gary Gygax. This is in Dragon number 36. And the interesting thing is that this presents Gary's D&D write-up for Robert Howard's Conan the Barbarian.
Excellent.
It's specifically about Conan, right? And the table there presents him through a number of different ages. You see him at age 15 or 20 or 25. Interestingly, the primary thing is that he is presented as a multi-class fighter thief, a human, obviously, fairly high-level multi-class fighter thief, with a long, with really high abilities and a long list of customized powers and abilities that goes on for 2 whole pages.
Interesting.
And so here, Conan's a fighter thief, really high ability scores, and he has extra bonuses to weapons, and he can sneak and hide, and he has special saving throw abilities. He can't be surprised, and on and on and all this stuff. And one thing I will point out, he doesn't have raging.
What, interesting, doesn't have raging. So what year is this, Dan?
This is 1980. This is Dragon Magazine 36 from April 1980.
1980. Okay.
So D&D's existed for about 6 years now. The advanced game is out at this point.
So the interesting thing is, I feel like Conan and the sort of modern pop culture view of Conan has really shaped the direction we've seen Barbarians go over the years. Here's my thesis statement.
Oh yeah.
Right, I think that's really important. And one of the interesting things I find about Conan, and I'm kind of curious about this particular article and how it presents him, like what kind of armor is he wearing in this? I can't read any of that text.
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Is he's allowed? He's a fighter.
Yep.
So he's actually allowed to wear anything he wants. It says that personality-wise, until his later years, Conan scorned body armor and shield most of the time. However, in battle or perilous situations, he would usually don some protection like leather or chainmail, and then in his Aquilonian period, he would wear plate.
Yeah.
So interesting, he's actually permitted anything, but personality-wise says he usually doesn't want to.
So I always find that very interesting as how Conan is presented, right, and how much Conan gets.
Right.
And really, I think, and I'll tie this back to our articles we were looking at earlier, where they really kind of tied them more to Vikings, right? You had Viking Berserker was our original entry point into this. In that Conan, right, if you read the Howard books, yeah, he's not. Yes, he is the sort of the noble savage kind of character, right? Yes, he's from a less advanced society than those that he interacts with, but he's often in armor, right? He's not this this sort of man from the wilds necessarily.
Right.
And I feel, and I'm trying to but however, right, if you just go as far forward as, say, 1982, when we have Arnold Schwarzenegger playing Conan in the movie theaters, now he's bare-chested and loinclothed and, wearing furs and etc., right?
So I will say that mostly the artwork, right, on the original stories of Conan usually portrays him in a loincloth, bare-chested,
right.
Kind of sexy, I guess.
I think you're right there. I think basically we can blame this on Frazetta, right? Surely,
right, exactly.
Surely it's Frazetta's fault that Conan evolved in this direction, and thus I think opened the door for merging with a concept of something like Vikings or something like that.
I think you're right. I think you're right. A great point. Once again, pictures overrule text. You can write thousands and thousands of words and write 12 or 20 novels, and as soon as one artist comes through and draws your main character bare-chested, that's what's going to stick in everybody's mind, regardless of what you actually wrote down.
Yeah. I'm sad that I don't have it here at my desk anymore, but when we did our interview with James Malashevsky, I had a book, an early print book of a Conan novel, and the artwork on that front, he looks very Roman. He's got full-on Roman armor with the crest helmet and all that stuff. Which I
remember that.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Good point.
Fascinating.
Good point. And of course, Joshua in the chat there is also reminding us that 70s era Marvel Comics had a long-running Conan series drawn by John Buscema. Wonderful, wonderful artwork. Actually, as we're taping this, there's a 50th anniversary Marvel Conan comic that's on the shelves right at the moment, which is kind of interesting.
Excellent. Very
we did not pre-plan that.
Very appropriate, nonetheless, for our topic.
Yeah.
All right, so
Totally.
so here we have Conan with stats in Dragon Magazine, and presumably the point here to like you can play Conan, or that Conan can be an NPC or a monster. Like, how am I supposed to use this in my game?
Yeah, I think the intent when Gary published this, clearly the intention was to use him as an NPC, right?
Okay.
In line with the deities and demigods works, in line with all of the other giants in the earth that were being published at the time, is the DM would trot any one of these figures out as an extra powerful NPC that's maybe going to put the PCs in their place, maybe put the player characters either in their place or make them more cautious about the world, at least, about somebody who's presumably more powerful than they are, I think is the idea. Of like, look, this is the most this is the most powerful character in the game, and you need to watch out for them.
Yeah,
I think that's the intention.
Of course, the problem always with that is that the over the years the power scale of the game continues to go up, and then as you look back at these as they gain a little age, suddenly you're like, oh, I could take Conan. Pfft, no big deal.
Totally. That's totally a treadmill that we've always been on.
Yeah.
Actually, so I think about almost the last paragraph here says, don't rush to include Conan in your campaign, except perhaps to slay one or two brash characters who are too far out of line to accept gentle reproof. NPCs such as this are nice, though, for occasional encounters and as heavy artillery in case of extraordinary need.
That's great.
So, yeah, he's specifically there to kill player characters.
Yeah, that's great. So delightfully Gygaxian. Okay.
So if we move forward from the Conan write-up, I think in 1983, there is a Dragon magazine with the draft of the Barbarian player character. And then here we get to the Unearthed Arcana hardcover supplement in 1985. And basically you see the same thing here. And now you have the Barbarian player character class. They're a subclass of the fighter. And the thing that I want to emphasize here is they have a very long list of abilities, and they are one for one the same as the Conan write-up.
Interesting.
So paragraph after paragraph after bullet point has basically been copy-pasted from Gygax's Conan write-up. So, Paul, you said that image has informed our idea of Barbarians, and you couldn't be more right, because the text was practically just copy-pasted. So here you have a character that... Yep.
This is certainly the when I think of like the history of Barbarian and D&D, my brain immediately jumps to Unearthed Arcana. Like that's like, yep, that's what I think of. I think both because of this, like I think maybe in like '89 when I was playing first edition D&D, we probably had Unearthed Arcana and we're playing with a lot of the classes out of there. And then also the other major tie-in for me, of course, is the D&D cartoon, where all of the major characters are clearly like I almost can see the marketing guy at the table saying like, we have this book coming out, Unearthed Arcana. Can we get all those new classes that are in it into the show, please? Right? Because all of the kids, you have Cavalier, Barbarian, Thief Acrobat, they're all in there, right? They're all in that show.
It's a good point, and I suspect, someone could correct me, but I suspect the marketing guy at the table was quite possibly Gary himself.
Probably Gary, right?
Because at the time he actually moved out of Lake Geneva to Hollywood specifically to direct the multimedia entertainment portion of TSR. And my guess it was probably, and it's his book, so my guess it quite likely was actually him.
Yeah, you're probably right. Now, interestingly, as you look, if you use that as your source, you're looking at Bobby the Barbarian from the cartoon. He's got this big club that he can like cause earthquakes and stuff. He's definitely a little brash. But does he berserk? I think the answer is no.
Well, okay, so first edition, here we are, 1985, first edition supplement Barbarian, and they have that same list of huge number of abilities as Conan. Now they have, for the first time, they've got a D12 for their hit die. Each level, which is the time that happened. They are not expected to wear heavy armor. They're expected to wear, again, probably leather armor, light armor. They get an AC bonus in light armor, just like Conan did. And they have bonuses to weapons and saves and climbing and hiding. They have a bunch of thief-like abilities, surprising and jumping.
survival and first aid. It's actually the first time that I know that the game had a non-magical way of giving you back hit points, because they had a very small ability of first aid to give you back some hit points. They could also automatically detect magic and detect illusions. They have no raging ability.
Yeah, interesting.
There's still no raging ability. So not too surprised that Bobby the Barbarian on the cartoon didn't do that, because this class doesn't have that still.
Now, I remember a trend, maybe it was just my friends, or maybe it was culturally at large, to play Barbarians to the point where they hate magic. Now, was that actually in these rules at all? That like they're actively attempting to destroy magic? Okay, great.
That's the very first paragraph on the page that we're looking at, actually. It says that they distrust magic. They will not use magic items. They won't associate with magic users. They're actually not supposed to be in the same adventuring party as a magic user. And yes, they get extra experience points for destroying magic items. That's absolutely
so fascinating. Such a fascinating thing. I feel like that. You know, on the one hand, you have your barbarians who hate magic. On the other hand, you have your paladins who are righteous do-gooders. It seems like there was this trend to make these subclasses that just intrinsically would not get on with other members of the party. Like, who thought this was a good idea?
Well, okay, the creator of the game, Gary Gygax, right? He was the one introducing all of this stuff, and so I think that there was a long-running debate at the time and even now of, is it a good idea to balance more powerful mechanical abilities, more powerful numerical, bonuses with role-playing restrictions around who you're supposed to associate with, who you could have in a party, how much money you're allowed to keep for yourself, and in this case, whether you're actually required to avoid and destroy magic items or not. So you also see that with a Cavalier, right? There's a Cavalier class in this same work that does the same thing. They have a required list of opponents that they have to attack. Cavaliers go into battle and they actually can't pick what opponent they fight. There's actually a predetermined list of who they're supposed to fight first.
So odd. The interesting thing about those is that they sound clever and interesting for the individual player, but inevitably I feel like they always caused strife amongst the party. Like, always. Always.
If the Barbarian says that they can't adventure with wizards, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah.
It's like, you literally actually now just not have wizards in your party? That's like an enormous blow against D&D to require that.
Right. And I feel like most people I played with at the time just kind of ignored that as a hard rule and instead just exercised it at the table by being mean to each other. Right? Just oh, this is an excuse to be a dick to my friends. Great.
I think that's what happened to everybody. I think that the mechanical bonuses that would attract everybody to these characters didn't, you really couldn't follow through on the supposed role-playing restrictions, and therefore you just had broken, overpowered character classes.
Yeah, certainly I know that that's kind of the reputation that Unearthed Arcana has, right? Of sort of adding just overpowered stuff that kind of broke the game. Yeah.
And, maybe this is on the treadmill we're on about supplements. That's why you're going to get players to buy it. TSR was in financial difficulty at the time. Some people say they pushed out this product kind of early or something like that. And they're clearly more powerful characters, though, including the Barbarians. But still no rage.
Yeah.
I'll point that out. Still no rage.
Yeah, interesting.
Go ahead.
I see that coming up, our next image that you have queued up for us is 3rd edition. Do you have any experience with the 2nd edition era with the kit books and the complete blah 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 book?
Great question. I really don't, actually. So I didn't play a lot of 2nd edition. I actually never got any of the physical books to 2nd edition. Have you? Now I know that there was like a Viking source book. They had a series of historical books starting with Vikings, which is where we get the Berserker idea initially. Did you play with those, Paul?
I certainly had plenty of the complete X books, right? And then usually they had one for every class. It was a complete Wizard's Handbook, the complete Fighter's Handbook, etc. Which I'm sure added this concept of kits, right? Which was their way of adding even more sort of subclasses or subclasses or whatever. So I'm sure it took it in crazy directions. I remember, honestly, actually playing with a friend of mine in high school who got really into playing the Gladiator kit.
Right.
So, unfortunately, I don't have any of that stuff on me anymore. Honestly, I got rid of all of those books. I think, though, that it's probably, second edition is probably just more of the same, more of what we already have in first edition, and then just adding yet more and more of these extra variations and whatnot. So, yeah, unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't really make a good hard comparison. So I don't know at what point Berserking came in, possibly somewhere in that era.
Right. I agree. That's probably my guess too, and I agree that the second edition era stripped down in the core rules, stripped down the classes, the basic 4.
Here you go, William to the rescue for us here. Hang on, let's get this comment up here. He tells us there were several versions of Barbarian in the Fighters book, Berserker, then in the Vikings book, etc., even a complete Barbarians book. There you had a whole complete Barbarians book. Yep.
Oh, really?
There you go.
Crazy.
I'm
Okay.
not surprised by that. You really had every complete everything's book, which was honestly, I remember at first liking it as a teenager and then rapidly getting infuriated by it as we had like Drow of the Underdark and suddenly all of my players are playing Drow, and we had the complete book of humanoids, I think, where now my players want to play centaurs, and like it just broke the game over and over and over again to the point where I was just infuriated with them, and I was like, get this crap out of here.
Yeah, and I think we went through the same thing when you and I were playing third edition together. We went through the same thing, and a couple of supplements came out, and I think we got to the point where we're like, no supplements allowed.
Yeah.
No further supplements allowed. We're going to stop trying to balance it or deal with that.
And frankly, honestly, this is how I play 5th edition now. I always say, player's handbook only. Just get your Xanathar's Guide to Everything and your Elementalist whatever. I can't remember what the Elemental one is. That's the one that leaks in a lot. I'm like, no, player's handbook. That's it. That's what I want to play with.
And of course, that's what we decided for the Big Bad Show last year. Is that partly having a number of different players come in week after week. We were going to stick with player's handbook stuff only to make sure everybody was familiar with it. And that itself was actually not. We actually had some issues sticking with that because the D&D Beyond software product doesn't separate things out so precisely, as a matter of fact. So sometimes you would have stuff bleed in spells from a supplement or something like that I accidentally picked because it wasn't entirely obvious they were from supplements.
Yeah, definitely that software, it tries. There are definitely places where you can say filter by this source or that source, but there are unfortunately a few places where stuff can accidentally bleed in. And it's not to say any of that stuff is bad, right? Like our problem with it really, or at least my problem with it personally, is that it's just too much to vet, right? Especially for a show where we're very much trying to say, that it's a competition, so we need a fair playing field. To then say like, well, now I have to vet all this material.
Exactly.
Just gotta get some limits in there.
Totally. Yeah. Totally agree with that. Before we move on from this page, I kind of like to deal with Josh's question that he had a couple minutes ago, actually, about 4 minutes ago. So it starts with, do you think that, if you can pull that up on screen.
Give me a second there, I'll find it. There it is. All right, Josh asks, do you think that if you did enforce the restrictions, it would work? I mean, in a grown-up way where the players all agree we're going to... That's it.
Have a party with some barbarians, so let's have no magic users. I think it's an interesting question. Do you think that would... so now, when this originally came out, I was a teenager. The role-playing restrictions didn't seem to work at the time. Do you think now that we're all mature, sensible adults, Paul, that we can have a conversation with each other that wouldn't happen anymore? You could try. Nothing's impossible, right? I think that it's tough, and especially when you start to look at things like Adventurers League, right? Like any time where you say, it's not a very closed system where we're going to discuss the setting up front and make sure we're all on the same page. Like once you get into like, is it official, right? Then it gets messy.
Depends on the people, I think, right? Yeah, for sure. And I think there's fun to be had in that direction of, you know, I remember a game you ran, Dan, where all the players just organically decided we're all going to be wizards. Just going to be a party full of wizards and see what that's like, and that might be fun, right? I could see a game
barbarians
of like
allowed.
all barbarians, like we're going to play all barbarians because awesome, and it would change the tenor of the game, and it might be interesting. Yep. You even have offshoot games, right? You have like what's the somebody made a Hyperborea, an old school game, something Swordsman of Hyperborea. Am I getting it right?
I think so, actually.
Astonishing Swordsman of Hyperborea. That's the one I'm thinking of. Played a game of that at a convention not too long ago, where it's really like, yep, we were all barbarians, man. We were all kind of in that area. You could do it for sure.
Maybe it would work. I mean, certainly it's a curveball in character creation to sit down as a party and say, what's our party composition going to be? I'll agree with that and have restrictions in that nature, versus every player having their own customized character that there's nothing in the character except what the player wanted. That would certainly be a curveball. I don't know, maybe it would work better if the DM comes in and says, this is what the campaign's about, and restricts certain character classes, like you're talking about with that customized Hyperborea game.
Yeah. Right. Again, it's easier to do in a convention setting where maybe you're just coming with pre-gens and you go, here you go, everybody, here are the characters, right? Now you've super-enforced it. I think it would, honestly, it sounds fun to me. I would love to play a game at this point being like, we're all going to be barbarians and we're going to be super anti-magic. Go. Right? That actually sounds pretty cool, but I think it certainly requires some setup and buy-in at the start before you're rolling out your characters. Yeah.
Interesting. Cool.
All right, shall we pop forward to 3rd edition?
Yeah. So here we are in the core rules of 3rd edition. Came out about 2000, and here's the page in Barbarians here. And the main thing here is that now they have the raging ability that we're familiar with. So at this point, maybe that was tested in the 2.5 era, but now you actually have a core rule, the first core rule book that has Barbarians in it, first of all, and the first core rule book that has Rage as their primary ability of interest. And that's almost about it, actually. The Rage adds to their Strength and Constitution for a temporary amount of time, 4 points. They have extra movement, they have Uncanny Dodge, and they do have damage reduction that reduces the damage they take. And actually, those 4 abilities are it. So Raging, extra move, Uncanny Dodge, and damage reduction. And now you have Rage as the prominent number 1 ability they have that's going to be carried with them forward in future editions.
Interesting. It's fascinating because we saw that Rage originated all the way back in Chainmail with the Berserkers, and the interesting thing is I keep trying to think of like what is the literary source of this, and I'm trying to think of characters who did this in a story that is that could have inspired the D&D trope, and I'm struggling to find it, honestly. The only things I can think of are books that are clearly derivative of D&D, where they clearly started with D&D and we're like, okay, well, we're going to have a barbarian because that's in D&D. Do you know of any literary types that raged?
I don't.
Yeah.
Nope. I totally agree with you. I mean, to me, this is clearly like there's an interesting mechanic sitting over in the Berserker NPCs. There's an interesting character class of barbarian hanging out with Conan, and over time, the mechanical interesting thing got merged into the barbarian. And I agree that the Raging Barbarian doesn't really have any pulp tradition to mind.
It's interesting. Similar, say, to the cleric, right? Of what's the origin of the healing holy man?
Good point. Now, okay, so in the chat, got a really good point of the Irish mythological character Cuchulainn, who was famous for going berserk in battle. That's a really good point. And his, of course, he was half demigod, and so in battle, Cuchulainn would his curly hair would stand on end, and his eyes would start bleeding, and his ears would start bleeding, and he would gnash it. He would bite on his shield, and he would kill everybody in visible range, possibly one of his own allies or friends. That's actually a good point. That actually is probably the now it's, of course, I usually think about Appendix N Pulp Fiction type stuff.
Yep.
and I can't do anything like that. But that's actually a really super good example of a mythological figure who totally did that. That's a really good point. And, you know, as someone who is, you know, my last name is Collins, and as someone who's of Irish descent, you know, it feels familial. Like I get it. Like when I read the Tarn, which is the Irish the Tarn Bo Cúailnge, which is the Irish myth cycle with Cahulan, I was like, this feels really close. Everything, people being really angry like this, that feels really close to home. Like I think I'm being attacked by Cahulan, and you don't want that, frankly.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Fascinating. Yeah, it's very interesting, the sort of, you know, I guess just how derivative the barbarian is, or how organic its creation is in our setting, through you know, the combination of all these things. And yet now it feels super classic, right? It feels like an obvious classic element of fantasy roleplay settings. We expect to see it. We you know, we do see it all the time in our games.
Right. My question is, you like the Rage? Like, you know, to me, having, you know, played early edition stuff, Rage still sits there, and I know that it got copied in at a later date from the Berserkers. Do you like them being merged, or would the Barbarian be even more interesting if the Rage wasn't there and they did the other stuff instead?
I don't know. I mean, it certainly adds personality, right? Because it comes not only with statistical advantage, but like a very clear roleplay element just pre-boiled in, right? Like your character's on the, you know, on the hinge of like losing it, right? You're playing a character who just becomes, you know, just completely susceptible to their anger, you know.
Here's a question. Like,
yeah.
And again, clarify if I've got this wrong. In 5th edition, the character rages. Is there any requirement of what they do at that point? Like, can the barbarian in 5th edition retreat or withdraw if they want to while raging?
Well, the important thing is they lose it in any round in which they did not cause or take damage.
I see. Okay.
So if they didn't directly attack a thing or take some damage from an enemy hitting them, then the rage is gone.
But they can be raging, decide to run away, one round later lose the rage, and they're successfully out of the fight.
I believe pretty much any time there's a like bonus action, they can just drop it. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So that's clearly different from early on with Berserkers, where the primary trade-off was you get a bonus to hit, and you cannot retreat from combat. You have to fight until one side or the other is totally dead.
Right.
That, to me, that's the one thing about like 3rd, 5th edition style rage is like, and you know, you get these bonuses, but are you really out of control? Kind of not, because player still has full control over what the character does.
Yeah.
So to me, that feels like a little bit of a round peg in a square hole.
Yeah, certainly it's there. I feel like the implication is there just in the name, right? Like it's called Rage, and I think most people are familiar enough with the trope that they're gonna tend to lean into it. But you're right. There's nothing mechanically forcing them into this behavior.
Right.
Interesting.
The other thing I would point out is that, you know, initially barbarians were characterized by an enormous list of very long special abilities, like at least a dozen or 20. Climb, surprise, extra AC, extra weapons, saving throws, detect illusion, on and on and on and on. And that's clearly been shaved down, or maybe at least folded into the skill system over time. And so now, like you get to 3rd edition, barbarians basically have these 4 abilities that they have from levels 1 to 20, including uncanny dodge, which, you know, adds a defense against traps and things like that. So it's kind of interesting that they had this very long list of kind of miscellaneous stuff that got cut down, and basically highlights something totally different, which is the rage, which they didn't have as of, say, 1st edition.
I'm kind of curious, Dan, as being the one of us with a more comic book background, Do you think that there's any influence in the Barbarian from the Incredible Hulk?
Well, that's a really good question.
Because the more I talk about it, the more I think like it's a limited set of times it can happen. It's a thing that they rage out, right? They Hulk out, right? They become much more powerful, possibly less in control. It feels very similar to what I know of the Incredible Hulk. And as we know, certainly there's a lot of comic influence on D&D.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, I will say that, of course, that's the thing that the Hulk is known for. That the character that I've read the most, the Mighty Thor from Marvel Comics, comes from Viking mythology, and they also work that into the Thor comics once in a while. Someone goes into a Viking rage. There's at least one comic where Thor does that, and then that's considered to be taboo. And he's punished by Odin as a result of how could you possibly dare succumb to Viking rage? It's the number one thing you're not allowed to do in that issue. So it's also baked through the whole Norse mythology comics of the Thor comics from time to time, which is a good point. There's at least one scene I know where Thor is talking to the Hulk actually and saying, "Oh, don't worry about the upcoming fight. You'll go into your Berserker rage and everything will be fine." I know how that works.
That's funny.
So that's kind of a good point, actually. Maybe we know that a number of things like from the Doctor Strange comics certainly bled into D&D. So that's actually pretty good point. Yeah.
So it's interesting that we've lost these kind of negative impacts, right? Yes, you're right. In 5th edition, there's nothing that forces the Barbarian to like go nuts and possibly even attack friendly targets, right? Likewise, I would say the Paladin lost the ability or the detriment, right, of like just lose all your powers if you piss off your god, right? And I can see why, right? I can see why certainly players don't like to have their toys taken away and whatnot, and other classes don't have that, right? If I play a wizard, I'm not going to suddenly lose my spells because I didn't role play right. Is this good? Is this bad? I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, it does. I could be crazy. It does feel. And look, I'm mostly a DM, right?
Yeah.
So I don't. I got to admit, I don't suffer from these penalties, and I haven't really played through the experience of losing that kind of stuff. To me, it does feel like the play space is a little bit more constrained. It feels like in the early days there was just a lot more possibilities to the D&D world, that potentially a lot more dangerous things could happen from day to day. Maybe you find a magic item that just increases your level, or a wish that boosts all your abilities up to 18 or stuff like that. Or you just entirely lose your class. Paladin, something wrong, you entirely lose the class and now you're a fighter instead. And it does seem like over time, as the system gets more complicated and there's more cohesion in the different systems, it would be harder to make that happen. It would be more punishing to the players, and therefore those kinds of like really out there happenings have sort of been taken away. And to me, it does. I got to admit, it feels to me like a slightly thinner play space because of that. Am I crazy about that?
No, I see what you're getting at. It's tough, I think, right? Again, you're always going to get the fairness argument, right? The sort of, so-and-so's playing just look at like cleric versus magic user. Like my magic user doesn't have to worry about making his god angry and thus not being granted his spells. I don't know though. You're right though, because it doesn't. Yeah, you lose some ability to enforce the milieu onto the players. And I wonder if there's another way around that. I'm like racking my brain trying to come up with like how else could you have a barbarian class that encourages that kind of like lose control attitude without like actively smacking down the player and saying like, nope, you got to attack your friends.
Right. Now I will say that there's never been a version of D&D where attacking your friends was either common or going to happen automatically. I think the only place I saw that was the Dragon number 3 article that had like maybe a 1 in 6 chance. I'd have to look it up, but even that was super, super rare. There's never been a core barbarian presentation where they ever had a chance of attacking their friends, actually.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, not retreating is either do or die when you go in a rage. It's a pretty big penalty. Yeah. Obviously, over time, there's been this philosophy of becoming more and more and more careful about stepping on player autonomy. What I want for my character to happen, be more and more careful about taking that away. And certainly some people find that to be really incredibly taboo, to the extent whereby some people recommend you have an advanced conversation about whether charm spells or hold spells or paralysis spells are allowed to be used against player characters in D&D today. So certainly those kinds of things of taking away abilities or taking away choices in combat would be much more anathema to a lot of players today than it was at one time, where maybe the characters were more disposable, or you had multiple henchmen, and it was more expected that the characters were going to be taken away on a regular basis. Like as soon as Conan shows up. If Conan shows up, the DM is trying to kill either one or two player characters. That's why Gygax put him in the game, frankly. Now that would probably blow some people's minds.
That's hilarious. So I'm reminded. I feel like there is still a middle ground to be found here, I guess, and I'm reminded of playing the old Hero Quest and Warhammer Quest games from the early '90s, late '80s, where again, because actually I don't know where this tradition comes from, but if you look at any times that sort of Games Workshop and Milton Bradley got together and built stuff, their core fighter character was always a barbarian, right? They never had, like, if you go back to Hero Quest, the 4 character types are dwarf, elf, wizard, barbarian. That's what you get.
Really?
Yeah, those are your 4 heroes. Okay. And I liked it, honestly. It was a little more flavorful, right? Like, barbarian is just a little more flavorful than, you want to play a heavy armored fighter. Well, that's a dwarf, right? Yeah. Right. And as I recall, in those games, the barbarian character had a pretty strong attack, but the like, you flubbed the roll, that you rolled a 1 effect was that every square around you got attacked, right? A little bit of damage to everything around you. So it was just, it was more like splash damage from a fireball, right? Like, just like okay, well, we can deal with that if we just shove the barbarian out there, right? And don't defend him, send him out, and then there's no problem. Right. But yeah, oops, darn it, I'm standing next to the barbarian and he rolled a 1, and now I take a point of damage because he just loses his shit and flings around and flails about wildly. I like that. Right? So I kind of feel like you could have a mechanic like that in a 5th edition barbarian, and it would be okay without taking away autonomy from the players.
Yep.
I'm not exactly sure. My brain is not connecting the dots completely into how to house rule that into being, but I feel like something like that could exist.
Right. Interesting.
And
one thing I'll say. Yeah. One thing I'll say about Hero Quest there with Barbarian, one of your 4 main classes, is as someone that's lived with D&D all my life, I actually kind of forget that the term fighter, if you were not a D&D player and you came to that, isn't incredibly meaningful. Yeah. If someone says you're a fighter, I'm like, well, I assume that everybody in the game's all fighting, I assume, right? Everybody's a fighter.
Yep.
And of course, originally called Fighting Man, which comes directly out of historical military texts, of course, isn't super flavorful. So I think if I was the marketing person at the outset of D&D, I'd say, don't name that fighter, name it warrior at least, right? A warrior or barbarian or something like that would be a more meaningful name.
Yeah.
So barbarian, you immediately get, like, anybody would have an immediate visual sense of that, whereas fighter is pretty generic. Doesn't really tell you a whole lot for people if you're not a D&D player to begin with.
Yeah.
So I can see that.
Yeah. I agree. And also, I think there's also an element there to the old Warhammer or Hero Quest games where you're trying, you have a sort of racist class, right? Because again, you have dwarf and elf as character types, and we don't have race versus class. And there's an interesting thing there of trying to differentiate what is the difference between a dwarf and a fighter, right?
Yeah.
And so just saying, like, we are just going to let the dwarves be our heavy armored, expert martial character type is interesting.
Right. You know, actually, that's another point. We actually didn't get into it today in the historical sequence. Is barbarians, when they originally showed up, were humans only. So Conan's a human. All the Dragon articles said that barbarians had to be humans, nothing else. You see it in that first, the Unearthed Arcana supplement had to be a human. Once you get to 3rd edition, of course, the artwork that we saw, the canonical barbarian was half-orc in 3rd edition. But we're opening it up. We're giving more options. You can play any race-class combination, and we're going to present the half-orc as the barbarian. Now,
I find that really surprising. That's because certainly in 1st edition we had half-orc as a playable race, and that just seems like a classic combo. I guess I'm surprised that 1st edition did not allow half-orc barbarians. When did that come into play? Is that 3rd edition? Did 2nd edition open that door? I'm pretty
sure that's 3rd edition. Because 3rd edition was the point where they removed the race class restrictions.
Gotcha.
That to my knowledge, that still existed through all through 1st edition, 2nd edition, and 3rd edition said, we know that you are all taking races and classes and you're mishmashing them every which way, regardless of what the rules say. So now you have full authority that you can take any race and apply it to any class that you want. You know, and now it's obviously that was an opening up of the book. Now I'm sure that some people would point to that 3rd edition stock character and say this is troublesome, perhaps, identifying half-orc with barbarians.
Yep.
But certainly a lot of people at the time thought that was a freeing and removing of restrictions from races at the time. So yeah, I think there was the habit through Gary's work in 1st edition that any kind of special thing, many of the subclasses could only be humans. So I think illusionists, druids, barbarians were usually humans, and maybe one other race only, perhaps, would be the constant thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are close to running out of time here, Dan. You got any final thoughts on barbarians?
Well, they're interesting. I still kind of wrestle back and forth about whether the raging belongs with barbarians or that should have been berserkers only. And I got to admit, I like some kind of reflection. If you're going to rage, I do like some kind of reflection of limitation of choices about not being able to run out of the fight. And that's kind of makes it more, higher risk, higher reward. It's kind of hard for me to move away from raging that still allows you to do whatever you want. So that's kind of where I am with it myself. Once you get to 3rd edition, I'm not totally 100% happy about it, but it makes a lot of players happy, and maybe that's more important.
I think there's a very subtle push in that direction with the limitation of you're going to lose your rage if you don't cause damage or take damage. And unfortunately, the thing that makes me twitch then is what I hear very frequently amongst players of finding clever ways to take damage, right? Like punching themselves in the face or otherwise doing things to intentionally damage themselves to keep the rage going, which I guess, is maybe somewhat in the spirit, but is also just feels very gamey to me, right? Doesn't,
Right.
Yeah, I think the way to deal and take damage is to be constantly running into the fight.
Right. I guess maybe I would start imagining a rules edit whereby they have to bite their own shield or weapon and either damage their face or their shield by doing that. Maybe that's some flavor.
Yeah. All right.
I was recently told that I was insane, so maybe you shouldn't use that.
Oh dear. I think it's a pretty fun class in 5th edition. I'm pretty happy with it, honestly. I like this. I like the notion, honestly, of them being more defensive than offensive, but they're inclined to offense because of that, right? Like it's a very subtle maneuver, but it's this notion that their abilities are mostly to absorb damage. Ergo, they end up in the front of the fight because that's where everybody wants them, so that they can use their ability to absorb damage. So I like that. I'm enjoying playing with one in my regular game. I was running the Citadel of the Severed Hand, which is a one-page dungeon contest winner. And so it's written for old school stuff, and there's a very minor, like, 3-word thing in there about this guy's got some berserker mushrooms on him. And I spun on that for a while. I was like, what does that mean? And of course my players find it. And so I came up with a house rule on the fly of it meant that if the barbarian character ate one of those mushrooms, it would keep his rage going without the damage requirement. So, which again is just, I think, helped make it a very minor magic item, but sort of makes it this, he loves them, and of course now, like, you know, when he's like frothing mad and like getting ready to fight, he's jamming mushrooms in his mouth, which is kind of funny.
we all like the combat mushroom in the mouth routine.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah.
That's great. All right. So Barbarians. Okay, they stay in the game. All right.
All right, they get a pass.
There's a lot of flavor to them. Yeah. All right. We'll keep them around. Good for you. Good for you, Barbarians. You've been doing well.
Awesome. If you viewers have any thoughts on Barbarians you'd like to share with us, any funny stories or interesting views or stuff that's happened with Barbarians in your game, please share them with us in the comments. Also, if you have if there are any particular of the other classes that we have yet to cover that you would like to make sure that we cover here in Season 3, do let us know, because that is on our radar to try and fill in those blank spots. So drop us a comment below.
Definitely, and look at the chat that's already happened, because there's a lot of good ideas for optional rules or edits to your Barbarians we already have. So if you build on that, we will look forward to seeing that conversation continue. Remember that you can like and follow and subscribe to us, the Wandering DMs, on a bunch of social media sites like YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and Facebook, and we do have the handle Wandering DMs on all of those sites. So please look for us there.
If you prefer to listen to us in audio-only podcast format, you can find our shows on our website at wanderingdms.com. And we're also carried by the major podcast carriers, such as Apple, iTunes, and Google Podcast, and Spotify, and Stitcher, and all such places. If you are listening to one of our podcasts from one of those sites, please take a moment to rate and review us there. That helps us out a lot.
It definitely does. And as usual, thanks to our growing list of patrons who support the Wandering DM show here. We have gotten so much support from you guys in the last year. We really, truly appreciate it. We're looking to build on our successes in 2020 as we go forward. If you have the capacity and you would like to join our patrons in supporting Wandering DMs, please visit patreon.com/wanderingdms, and you'll see our different tier levels there. Hoping to do a whole lot of interesting stuff this year. Sunday talk show, various game shows through the week, different benefits for patrons that we're rolling out. Normally we have a Discord chat after the show. We're actually going to skip that due to scheduling problems here today. Paul, are you starting up 10 Dead Rats again?
10 Dead Rats will be starting again this Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Please join us for Season 3 of 10 Dead Rats.
Awesome. I will be looking forward eagerly to that, as a matter of fact.
Excellent.
And don't forget that we are live every Sunday with the talk show that you're currently watching or listening to, Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So please, we hope that you'll join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then.